Hello, everyone. This is Landon Anderson, and our guest today is Jared.
Hello.
And today we're going to be talking about the differences in the makeup of sci-fi and fantasy anime. Alright, to start, we're going to give a little primer on what we're considering anime. So basically, any cartoons that come from specifically Japan that share the classic animation style, and then particularly we're looking at sci-fi and fantasy as genres and settings in anime. Um, some of the background research I did in an article from Cho, uh, they did a study looking at lots of different anime and the different focuses that they could fall under. And one of the dilemmas they faced in that was that they had trouble deciding like if certain anime would fall under either sci-fi or fantasy, or if the categories could overlap in any like way, shape, or form. So today we're just gonna try to look at that issue and discuss why we think the two could be different, where they overlap, and where they're kind of the same. All right, like I said, to start with, Jared, I'm gonna pose a question. What do you think separates sci-fi settings from fantasy settings, especially like when considering anime as like the medium being used to display them?
So, what I think that sci-fi anime, like the setting for a sci-fi anime usually like takes place in a world that's shaped by like advanced technology. So it's like they usually have like futuristic cities and like they have high-tech labs and robotics and all that type of stuff. Like some animes give us like those dense technological cities, and then like some of them go to like outer space or have like a beyond an Earth type of feel. But and then like the fantasy, like most fantasy animes usually stick to like a sort of like medieval style. Like they usually have like medieval kingdoms and like royalty type of stuff, and they have like magical forests, ancient ruins, and like enchanted landscapes and all that sort of thing with like spirits and stuff. So I think like you can like differ the two. You can like put them in both categories based on like the setting.
Alrighty, we'll move on to our first big segment here. We titled this one "Technology versus Spirituality." Um, hmm. Well, looking through our genres, like our settings of sci-fi and fantasy. When you think of sci-fi, most people think of something like robotics. They think of something like futuristic, like mechanistic, something along those lines. And that's really ingrained, like the idea of like technology and progress. Uh, Whereas if you're thinking the other way around, if you think if your setting is like fantasy, I mean, like we said, most fantasy like elements in a setting take a lot of their not just like houses and like landscapes and stuff, but they take like a lot of their environments from like a medieval setting. Like even just like characters will be based like their races will be like elves, dwarves. Like you'll have enemies that are like goblins or like dragons and stuff, and the way that those characters like came to be comes through like a human sense of like spirituality where uh, like back in the day, like in the past, humans tended to be more spiritual just in nature.
Well, spirituality is spirituality is just a human thing, man. It's just what humans believe in. So, especially for medieval, like for medieval people didn't have anything else except that to believe in. So,
You could call it like a lack of technology that created it, where instead of being able to figure things out on their own, people came up with a more grand explanation for more commonplace ideas. So like a lot of people were more religious. People would come up with tales. It's where we get something classic like hero's journey, or like the hero's journey idea. In like the specifically though, if we think about certain anime that would fit into this kind of like mold for like a sci-fi setting, we'd think of something like cyberpunk or something maybe like a little older that would also fit would be like Akira, where or even anything that kind of like takes place in the future in like an urban area. You could consider for this because like the worlds that they take place in are like steeped with technology, whereas when you think of like the same kind of idea in a fantasy setting, it's usually not powered by actual like electricity or like some like natural gas or like oil, like or it's nothing like advanced like that. Instead, they'll be powered by like actual something like spirits, in the fantasy setting. Have to do with kind of like some kind of magical, or they always are represented by some kind of like magical energy source, whether it be like usually you'll see it with something like the elements will be represented by like a some kind of like earthen like creature, maybe like a fairy or like a pixie, but or like some kind of like spirit. But in general, they kind of fall under the same umbrella, where they're a source of energy that isn't created by technology, but rather just by like the world itself, which is more of the spiritual side of things. Yeah, and some like particular anime, I guess, to be like a good showcase example for that. Uh, Anything like fantasy base. Something more recent would be like Free Ren. Like, of course, magic is a huge factor there. Jobless reincarnation. Any like power system involving magic usually has like a spiritual basis, whether it could honestly transcend genres too. If you think of something more shonen, like Bleach, Dragon Ball, those like their power sources come from like ki, or even in like Naruto, you would say like chakra or something. Those come from like a spiritual basis rather than like a technological one, which is kind of screams fantasy anime more than sci-fi. All right, moving on to our next like segment here. We're gonna talk about what it means to be human, specifically, of course, through the lens of sci-fi and fantasy settings. Um, in particular, I think the way that they really differ is like the mediums of like non-human humans, like what they use to explain that concept. Uh, in sci-fi shows, you think robotics again, so you're thinking of something like cyborgs, like androids, people with like prosthetic limbs, um, or like AI, something along those lines. Whereas in like a fantasy setting, you're thinking more like magical creatures, like spirits, any like things with that just like don't really look human, but they still like the common like denominator between the two. I guess I would say is you think
Mm-hmm.
they would like share emotions, they share like their own thoughts. They might share like a voice, like a unique voice. Um, but they have the ability to like be a single like working person without actually being human exactly, even if it's just like the species or like um, the like how they look is what's setting them apart from one another. uh, I think in particular we can look at an example. I know me and Jared have both watched Danmachi, where they like a brief summary, I guess. Like they're in like a magical world ruled by gods, and there's like
Okay.
a dungeon that all the adventurers adventure into.
Yeah. Well, in Danmachi, they all follow the gods. So.
Um, and in the dungeon are monsters, because of course there are, and a subset of those monsters are called Xenos, where they
Oh,
can
those
actually,
those.
they're like
Oh,
intelligent versions
those.
of the monsters,
Yeah,
where
yeah,
they
yeah,
have like the
yeah,
ability to speak human speech, and they basically have like everything that you would need to quantify someone as a human, except of course they have the appearance of being like a monster. Um, and like among them, like just like you would see with humans, there's like varying emotions, and various like states they take towards their existence. Like some people want to coexist with the humans, some people want to like fight the humans, some people feel that like they're strong enough to try to leave the dungeon and be their own people, but of course everyone outside is a human, so there's a lot of conflict surrounding that, and that's just like one example. It's definitely more of like a fantasy show than a sci-fi show, where if we thought of like a sci-fi setting that would bring the same like sort of example, you could think of something like the way like Ghost in the Shell or Akira has these humans, who, or even some of like Cyberpunk Edge Runners, I guess is the best like modern example. Like he's the main character, like David starts out as just like a normal guy, but then like to progress like like in the societal like echelon in the show, he constantly is replacing his human body parts with robotic ones that like will enhance like his abilities. Um, and I guess the argument you can make there is like, is he like losing his humanity as he replaces his physical parts, um, or is he still a human because like his brain is intact? He still has like his memories, his emotions, his thoughts, his feelings towards all the people he's interacted with. Um, and I think those are two pretty good examples of how sci-fi and fantasy both are trying to share like the same message about humanity, but they're using it through the two like unique lenses provided to them from their kind of like societal standards, or I guess from their you could even call it like the like cliches built into the genre.
Yeah, like the if you put a face, yeah, just put a face on something, then if you draw a face on something, then you're more likely to remember it. Like if you put like a keychain with like a face on it on your keys, then you're most likely not to forget about it. 'Cause that's how humans are.
And then here's a like another quote, or I guess just like a little bit from a research article I found. Again, this one's by Osamu Sakura. Uh, he says that in well, basically what they did in the study is reverse um, they reverse searched like on the Google search engine for images including robots in both the like Japanese and on global, so like European and American servers. They just reverse searched the word robot and they tallied the results of the way they were like the robots were pictured in the images. And specifically, it says that in Japanese images, robots tended to be pictured more as comrades to humans and individual entities, whereas in like Western societies, the images tended to portray robots more as like tools or weapons or like servants to humans. Um, and I think just from that quote alone, we can say that like since anime is like a Japanese medium, we get a lot more of a biased approach towards the way robots are being treated. And I think people who like have watched anime could definitely say that compared to something like a Western movie like Terminator, or if you look at something like Wall-E, like the relationships between humans and robots in anime is a lot more like friendly, cordial. Like it really highlights this quote compared to like Western media. All right, I guess we'll move on to our next part now since we're running kind of low on time. Uh, this like segment, we kind of wanted to discuss about the conflicts that happen uh, in sci-fi and fantasy anime, or like anime that takes place in those settings. Uh, Particularly, we kind of talked about this a little beforehand, but like in sci-fi anime, the characters are really restricted with like what they can do. They're usually fighting like a dystopian government, or some kind of like super mega corp. Just like there's a real like hierarchical structure that they're climbing like up to fight against. Whereas in anime that have like a fantasy setting, usually the characters are more free with the way they're able to like move and like have conflicts. Um, like we talked about free run. You talked about something like dungeon meshi. The characters can fight against pretty much anyone. Uh, it could be like other like adventurers. It could just be other like random people. It could be like non-humans. Just kind of uh, a lot of like less. It's just they have a lot more freedom to choose their conflicts, and there's a lot more emphasis on the way that like small events will like affect them over time, or like smaller conflicts affect them over time. Whereas in like the sci-fi shows, their conflicts are pretty much always driven as like a small like underdog versus larger, more funding, more technologically advanced enemy, and usually it's like a human who's like misusing their power.
Yeah, and in most like fantasy shows anyway, like the main character usually has some sort of hierarchy ability that makes them dominate. But even if they don't have that, they still have knowledge of the a better world, I guess you could say. I want to talk about free run the first thing. I was gonna talk about free. So like the free one with like the medieval stuff is like so like the whole point of free run is like the story is already over. Like they already defeated the main villain. So like they're exploring the world again, but it's only for us to see the viewer and also like the other main characters like Fern and Stark. to explore. Because Freeran has already seen everything anyway. So like, but she's still like the strongest. She's still the strongest in this that we know of in this fantasy world.
Yeah, I think if you wanted to like look into how the conflicts are affecting the characters, um, talking about like sci-fi versus fantasy conflicts in sci-fi conflicts like cyberpunky type stuff, the characters usually experience like a power up, after they beat like a main enemy or like some kind of upgrade, like maybe they'll take like if the it, it's like if the character they beat, the boss or whatever had like a stronger weapon or stronger part, then the main character will like take it and use it for themselves. Uh, like it's more of like an upgrade, but it's always something that's like physical. Like a bigger gun, faster like legs or like engine, like something like that. Like David gets his like Sandevistan. Um, and he constantly keeps upgrading like as he fights like stronger people. Whereas like in fantasy, the I guess like the like air quotes upgrades are a lot more fluid. You see it a lot more in the characters like emotional states because it's more of like a journey than like a series of
Yeah.
stages.
She actually likes, I like in the show too, like it always cuts back to, it shows like a flashback and it shows her being like stone cold or something like that. And then we see like she does an entire like quest of like planting the flowers around the statue. So that's it's pretty good.
All right, this is gonna go on a little longer than we hoped, but for we're gonna do a little quick section on like isekai and then wrap it up at the end there. But yeah, uh, talking about specifically like how isekai as a genre, well, like not isekai alone, but isekai is a good example alone. Isekai is like a good example of like the impact of the settings have on like a genre that could take place in both. You think of isekai, something like Sword Art Online, you could see as like a bit more sci-fi, or something like we talked jobless reincarnation or like Konosuba would be like a lot more fantasy. Um, like as a whole, we kind of named this segment escapism versus identity, because when you think isekai, the characters are always trying to escape the world they came from. Either like they'll either like die or like be summoned in like a game or like from a book or like however method they get to the new world. The whole purpose is they're trying to escape. Like their paths and become a better person in like their new life, whether it be like some super cool like power they get or they just really just want to be like a more honest like better person in general, and how that kind of plays a role in the or like the setting could kind of help play a role in that transformation of a
Well,
character.
especially for like certain types of isekais. In ReZero especially, the main character, like he literally like there's no death, there's no nothing. He literally just goes there. And while he's there, he experiences something that makes him that reminds him of his home, like of what he left behind. Everything he left behind and everything he felt and everything that he stood for before he left. And it's basically he just didn't feel good about himself. He was a shut-in guy who didn't go to school, who felt isolated from the world, and he literally went to a different world to make a name for himself in that world.
Yeah, I think on like the flip side of the creating like this new like personality or identity of yourself as a form of escapism in like this new world, kind of like the antithesis, of the isekai is trying to like change yourself in the world that you're currently in, um, which I think is a lot more in tune with like cyberpunky sci-fi ideals than fantasy ideals. Um, if you think of like I've said this like 1,000 times, but like Cyberpunk Edge Runners is a classic where the character is constantly changing himself and then trying to accept like what he is, um, or something like Ghost in the Shell where the character is like struggling with their self identity, but it's not like they want to migrate and like throw away their past self, but more of like come to accept it and like almost like evolve into like a better version of themselves. And I think that speaks a lot more to the sci-fi audience. Uh, you could even consider some shows like these aren't going to be anime, but like kind of equivalents. Certain games or shows like Arcane, something like Arcane. The characters are it's definitely like cyberpunky where they're fighting up against like a larger corporation as like an underdog. But like in these types of shows, the characters aren't trying to like they're not leaving. They're not like running away from like their problems. They're trying to deal with it in a different way where they're like fighting it head on. It's kind of how we discussed earlier with the conflicts. Like they're actively fighting the people like directly above them and then taking their place and fighting up that ladder to try to become the next person at the top and fix things.
In fantasy or in sci-fi, the whole like I say in most sci-fi, it's all about like the main character and like the struggle that they're going through towards like identity. I think like most sci-fis are against the system or against like self-identity. Like for identity in Evangelion, the entire time Shinji he's torn up about himself and about his father. All he wants is to be acknowledged and to be understood by some others. He doesn't know how to express himself without like being judged or like how to act accordingly. Like he is fully at like um he's fully controlled by his emotions. Like he doesn't like think correctly. And I like no, like especially like when he has to make the choice of killing his friend who's in the Eva who's got taken over by an angel. Like he literally can't make a choice, so the dummy pilot has to take over because he literally can't make a choice, and he's so upset after that that he goes and like starts trashing the place at the main the nerve aid like headquarters.
Yeah, talking about like yeah, Eva, like as a whole, we think like we kind of talked about this beforehand, but together, we kind of decided to look at this as like our big like case study, I guess, for this topic, because we think it does a good job of mixing both the sci-fi side and the fantasy side of the types of like conflicts and like character arcs and like stories that we talked about earlier. And so for our final section, we're kind of going to be looking at Eva in particular.
I love the ending of the show, like the last two episodes where it's just like a very abstract, just talking. It's so good. Like he's just like he get like it's literally a decompression. Like everything that's been building up is just like it's just talking the entire time. It's just like about identity and about self-discovery and about wanting to be who you want to be and not caring what other people say and trusting others and helping others, and it's just a good ending. It's just a really good it's really good.
Yeah, I think the main like lesson, I guess, or like the main thing we kind of gained from looking at the two settings, like fantasy and sci-fi in general, and like the roles they play, in anime as a whole, is that certain shows definitely, like certain anime definitely lend themselves to one setting over the other. Like specifically, we mentioned Free Run, and most like isekai in general lean towards like the fantasy side, where obviously anything like cyberpunky or like mechanistic is going to be more sci-fi. Um, but there are like the certain shows out there, that can blend both settings together uh, to kind of like tell their narrative. Like of course we mentioned Eva. Think something like Sao. We talked about Darling in the Franxx a little before this, but it's it's not as easy to talk about in a class like this. But like there's a ton of other shows that just include both inspirations from like you could call it like sci-fi and fantasy or even like past and future or like future and past inspirations. We think so much of sci-fi as like a futuristic approach. or like a futuristic lens into a story. Whereas you can think of fantasy as almost like a past lens into a story, where it comes with like, we talked about religion, we talked about magic, it comes with like medieval tones. Like all of those things kind of help define what the our current like perception of what fantasy is. Um, and together they can both like play a role in making like play their role in like a single anime success, like we saw with Eva.
Truth nuked.